an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Magician's Apprentice, chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. In these chapters, well, it turns out that Tessia's classmate does not really like her and is not nearly as good at hiding the fact that he doesn't like her as he seems to think he is. Also, the slave that was left is under the impression everybody is being played and his master is most definitely coming back to get him and that there is going to be some comeuppance later on. And it had never even occurred to me that that was going to happen, but now that he has said it, I feel really dumb for not thinking of that. Thank goodness for mind reading. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. Many thanks to Ashleigh for commissioning this episode. I am really interested in how this is going to go down because I have been surprised by the way this author chooses to handle plot points before. There have been a lot of things that other authors would have sort of cashed in on, for lack of a better turn of phrase, in order to draw out a plot line for a long time and sort of build on that as its base. And rather than doing that, Trudy Canavan tends to undercut my expectation of something being a through line by having characters come out and address it right away. So that's already happened, honestly, because we have like Jayan being sort of told by Lord Dakin, I know you don't like her. I don't know what your problem is, but you kind of need to like get over it or at least be better about hiding it. And that was something that I thought, I didn't expect that to even be dragged out that much. I guess I just thought that Dakin was going to be willing to think the best of Jayan, and there's no obvious reason why Jayan shouldn't like Tessia. So I guess I just thought he would give him the benefit of the doubt and be like, oh no, I am mistaken. It's very clear that, like, you know, they just aren't used to each other yet. She's only been here for a couple of weeks. But as time goes on, it just becomes more and more apparent. It's almost like Jayan was sort of testing what he could get away with at first in terms of sheer, like, rudeness or dismissiveness. And he thought it was unnoticed, and so he upped it a little bit because he felt like nobody had picked up on it and he was safe. And he was mistaken on both counts. First of all, it had been noticed, and second of all, upping the ante was also noticed. This is not him getting away with jack shit. And the one thing I found surprising is that Lord Dakin doesn't seem to know what Jayan's problem is. Tessia is the one that kind of seems to figure it out and be like, you know, we go back to, and I will keep in mind that the last episode covering the first chapters of this was like a month ago, so people may not remember if they're not reading along. But when we were in Jayan's POV, he was thinking about the fact that he had been like low-key sort of hoping to maybe one day inherit from Lord Dakin, because Dakin doesn't have a wife or children of his own, and this kid being his apprentice and a noble birth, he would be next in line. And while it's unlikely that somebody like Tessia would supplant him, it's not impossible that she might wind up being this guy's wife. It's not impossible. It's like, it's really unlikely, but there's a threat there that he doesn't appreciate. He really felt comfortable in the position that he had, and he thought that he was in something that he could sort of rely on. And it looks like maybe not, you know? And other than that, there's also the snob in him that's coming out. it's interesting because when we're in Jayan's point of view, and I think this is a really tricky thing to pull off, and I kind of admire that Trudy Canavan has done it. I don't hate this guy. You would think I would, and I might begin to later, but Jayan just seems at this moment to be really self-centered and like sort of overly traditional. It doesn't feel, and I might be misreading, but it doesn't feel like he really thinks himself better than other people in a sense that's like, there's like a sincere superiority complex there. It's more that he seems to be just simply aware of social status and the way things work in the world. And he's very pragmatic about the realities of how things work in the world. And as much as you want to ignore that stuff and act like it doesn't matter, if you live in the world, society's expectations and social strata and tradition and all of that, it does matter. You know, you can choose not to follow it yourself, but that comes with consequences that must be taken into account. And those consequences come from the fact that those things do matter to people in power. So I'm really surprised at how, as much as he's like really snide and just sort of, I want to say it's that he's impatient with her, but he's not impatient. That's the thing. He tries to phrase it like that to Dakin and be like, well, you know, I know it's going to be so long before she's caught up. But really, he's self-conscious about the fact that she's learning faster than him. Like, she has gotten to the point where she can control her magic by the middle of these chapters, which he apparently wasn't able to do for almost a month. And he gets defensive when that's mentioned and says like 3.5 weeks, and then tries to say something about how like there was a visitor that slowed down his progress that they had to like take, you know, the kind of thing that's like, yeah, okay, buddy. Like, he just really hates the fact that it seems like if she doesn't just have more power than him outright, she is more talented at putting to use what she has. And this is an interesting thing to me because I have not realized until I have gotten a little bit more familiar with the world and the way that other people live and the attitudes that other people have. It's really struck me as someone who grew up without much money. I won't say that I lived in poverty. That's not true. But it was just that we were always aware of being on the edge of things, you know, like it was the sort of situation that so many people live in where if something happened and someone got sick, I mean, this like 2 paychecks, we had no idea what we would do. And continuing to live like that into adulthood, you just become really careful with the way that you handle your resources, and you are extremely conscious of the fact that things don't last, that you need to like make hay while the sun shines, because and that's part of the reason why getting like, I won't get into the whole financial aspect of it, but there is a lot psychologically that goes on when you are somebody who is used to doing without. And if you do live in true poverty, it's even more extreme. I mean, if you've ever met somebody who really grew up in intense poverty, you will recognize the signs, them saving every little thing and constantly wanting to give you things before you go because they can't use them, but they think somebody can use them and they want to make sure it doesn't get wasted. And it's, I can't help but wonder if some of Tessia's being more adept at controlling her magic is a byproduct of her, you know, being more of a commoner and having to be more conscious of consequences of things that she does and says than Jayan would be, because he's noble and people are going to give him much more of a pass. And on top of that, she's a woman. And women are just so ingrained with this understanding that whatever happens to us, most people will blame us for. And we have to be able to put ourselves in situations that are above reproach and compensate for someone else's behavior all the time. and just always be adapting and moving to whatever somebody says or does to keep ourselves safe and perhaps keep other people safe. And that's just socially something that is bred into us so deeply that it doesn't, like, it's not until the past few years that I've really come to realize how differently I look at the world than Owen. And Owen is not like, you know, your stereotypical entitled shitty dude bro. He is a very good person, and nevertheless, he still sees the world in a completely different way. So I don't know if Trudy Canavan is doing this consciously, if this is something that I'm like making up, but I'd like to think that Tessia, being as adept as she is at being careful and adapting to using her magic and, you know, the whole atmosphere of she is in a nobleman's house. She has been invited there, but she's very aware of the fact that she's a guest. And if she fucks up, she like destroys his property. The first test that she is given of trying to open the box that she imagines that has her magic in it, that causes her to break a vase. And what we saw that led him to realize she even had magic, she basically like destroyed an entire room. So it's not like Dakin is being a dick about that. He's completely conscious of the fact that that was an accident, that this shit is going to happen. When she breaks the vase on their first lesson, he's like, you know what? I shouldn't have done this in here. This is my fault. Like, we should really just go outside. But she, of course, takes that, like, she feels guilty, you know, like she should have done a better job. When in fact, he's her teacher and he knows that this is a possibility, but he just didn't think it through. And I really like that in concept, the idea that Jayan is like, he is resentful of her making better progress than him. But the truth is that she has just, for her position in the world, always had to be more careful about everything than he has ever had to be, you know? So anyway, that I don't think is an intentional thing, but I do think it's really like telling that Trudy Canavan in both this and in the Black Magician trilogy has chosen a lower class woman to be the unexpected source of natural magic in both of those. I don't feel like that's totally accidental and irrelevant. You know, I feel like that's because she's drawing a bit of a line, and I don't know how much she really wanted to like make a fine point on it, but whatever the case in that moment, it was, I just really felt like that was a particular interest, you know? So anyway, I'm going to back up. Chapter 6. Oh, sorry, Martin's here. Hi, Martin. He says he's a bit self-centered, but not overly so. Yeah, I feel like Jayan has potential to be better, I guess is what I mean when I say I don't hate him. There are some people that just, the way that they talk and look at other people, you can tell it's going to take a whole lot more work for them to move past whatever preconceptions they have about whomever they're looking at. And Jayan doesn't feel that way to me. He doesn't feel like a lost cause. He just feels like somebody who has not been faced with other circumstances and situations before. And he assumes that Tessia is aware of all of the same social implications of her power that he is aware of. And what's interesting is that's not true. And I'm going to get into that right now, actually. So chapter 6 starts off with Jayan and Malia like talking to one another. Malia is pretty much flirting with Jayan all the time. And this is something that's really, I think, part of why I feel like Jayan doesn't have as hopeless a personality as I might expect otherwise. The fact that he is willing to engage in these sorts of conversations with Malia and like that he doesn't find it just, what's the word I want? Impudent, I guess, that she would talk to him this way indicates to me a certain relaxed nature really underneath everything. And what I'm really kind of waiting, honestly, for the other shoe to drop on that and to see what he would do if she did kind of push it too far. What would his reaction be? Because I feel like that is the thing that would determine how I see him, is not how he treats her during the best of times, but if she fucks up, what does he do? How does he respond? But yeah, she's like talking to him about the outfit that he's wearing, because it's a really like, it's something that apparently the Imardian like magicians wear, and it is considered kind of silly and ridiculous apparently by ordinary people. And he is low-key relieved when he goes out to the dining room and he sees that the Lord is also wearing the same thing, because as much as he knows that this is what's expected and fashionable, and there's still a sort of self-consciousness to it that I found kind of amusing. Let's see. The robe was nearly long enough to touch the floor and all but covered the matching trousers he wore underneath. Both were dark green, and the fine material they were made from had a slight shine to it. And she asks him if the women also wear this, and he's like, I can literally not describe what the women wear. You wouldn't believe it, so I'm not even going to try. And she says, if I hadn't seen Lord Dakin wearing much the same thing, I'd have wondered about you, Apprentice Jayan. Don't go walking about in the village like that, or people will be talking about you from here to the mountains. As for your guests, they hid their surprise very well when they saw Lord Dakin. They're all in the dining room, by the way. So he realizes that she's basically being like, hey, you're late. Everybody's there already. And he just like teases her about being nosy and slowing him down. And we hear him, we are in his head, and he is thinking about going out to see Tessia and what could be going on in their minds now that they know that she has magic. And he specifically stayed in the room when he heard her and her family arrive. He hadn't gone out to greet them. And it's phrased as, they had more immediate things to be concerned about than meeting Dakin's apprentice. Dakin's other apprentice. The truth was, Jayan hadn't wanted to go out and meet them. He was not sure why. I don't dislike Tessia or her family personally, nor do I particularly like them or want to gain their favor. It was more important, he had decided, that he spend his time studying than being sociable. The sooner he became a magician, the more time Tessia would have from Dakin, after all. It wasn't as if she was from some important and powerful family that he might want to establish and maintain friendly relations with. She wasn't a land servant or crafter's daughter, thankfully, but she wasn't a woman of influence or connections either. Becoming a magician would elevate her, but it wouldn't make her the equal of other magicians. So, let's parse that real quick. I don't dislike them, but I also don't want to gain their favor. And this is the sort of thing that I think if somebody had sat in front of Jayan and been like, all right, dude, let's talk about that attitude, I think he might have the grace to be a little bit ashamed of it. But he doesn't really think about what that means about him. That basically, unless I can get anything out of this, I have no interest in being polite. Which is like kind of despicable. But also, if you're brought up to see people as opportunities, which you probably are if you're born to nobility, that's going to be part of your worldview and something that you have to unlearn. She wasn't a land servant or crafter's daughter, thankfully, but she wasn't a woman of influence or connections either. So basically, it could be worse. She could be even more low class. She could be even more useless to me. It could be even more uncomfortable to be around her. And then he thinks, this is why it's unfair on Dakin. He won't be gaining any of the good connections or favors owed from training her as he did by taking on my training, except perhaps respect for what might be seen as an admirable act of charity. If not that, then sympathy for having to obey the law on naturals. So he tries to sort of frame it as concern for Dakin's situation and the way people are going to see this, which is that's what we call concern trolling. Concern trolling is when a person has their own prejudice and they wrap it in the guise of caring about an issue really sincerely. It's just, I'm just worried about you. And and that is something that, like, the concern trolling that I have always heard has been fat phobia wrapped in concern for my health. And it's one of those things that, like, if you really want to know whether somebody is fat phobic or not, you look at what they associate being fat with. And most people associate being fat with being unhealthy, which is simply not the reality. And it is also based on a lot of junk science. And there are so many fat people that I have known who underwent cancer treatments, chemotherapy, radiation, lost a bunch of weight due to their cancer, and were congratulated on losing so much weight. They lost weight because they were literally dying. But sure, you give a shit about people's health. Get the fuck out of here. So that's kind of what he's doing, is just being like, well, I'm just really worried that Dakin won't be able to make any good connections, and that Dakin is going to suffer because of this, and that Dakin is going to have to, waste his time on her, and nobody's really going to give him anything good out of it, and that he's just going to be donating time, hopefully for people's good opinion, but really, what is that worth? It's not about that. Don't lie to yourself, but he is very good at lying to himself. With no influential or wealthy family behind her, she would hardly attract much favor among the powerful men and women of Curalia. It was unlikely that the king or anyone else would give her any important position or task to perform. Without such a wage or work, she'd never make much of an income. All this would not make her a desirable wife, so she wasn't going to attract a husband of influence or wealth either. She might, with hard work and time, gain a few allies and friends and slowly prove herself worthy of work with a decent income, and someone might marry her hoping her offspring would prove magically strong. But neither would happen if she stayed isolated in Mandarin. So this is something that I particularly thought was interesting, because the previous chapter to this one, we are in Tessia's point of view as she realizes that she has magic, as Lord Dakin comes to her house to tell her parents that he has some suspicions and tests her out, and he can feel it in her. And this leads to her thinking about all of these new opportunities that are going to be open to her now, that she doesn't have to marry right away because of what she is. And her mother even is entertaining ideas that she'll somehow be able to seduce Lord Dakin and maybe marry him, which is not something that she herself is at all interested in. And later on, she's very relieved when she feels him in her mind giving her her first lesson, that there is no sense of romantic feeling from him towards her either. He does not see her that way, and she's very happy about that. I just think it's really something that she sees this as such a huge deal and a huge opportunity. And Jayan is over here being like, well, this isn't really going to change all that much for her. And I don't really know enough about how things work in this era of Curalia's history to know how right he is or not. Is this sour grapes? Is he just being like, well, it's not going to change anything because he doesn't want it to change anything because he likes being the only one that's really got any kind of future? Or is he right, and Tessia and her mother are really overestimating the importance of her having magic in the grand scheme of things if she's not a noble? Because it seems like they both feel, and Tessia, I think when I say they both feel, I feel like Tessia believes this, but that she isn't actually interested. Nevertheless, she, I think, thinks her mother is maybe right, that she can leverage her ability into a better social position if she wants. And Jayan doesn't really seem to think that. He's like, you can maybe do a little bit better than where you are now, but it's not going to be as hugely important as either of them seem to think. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on that to see which of them is right, because I'm not sure how that's going to work out. And, I constantly think about how everybody must secretly want to be a magician, how like having magic is something that people probably talk about all the time and like wish that somebody in their family had magic. But then we have a scene later on where Tessia is helping her dad with a surgery, and all she does is create a light globe, and it makes the villagers feel really weird around her and get like kind of jumpy. And so I almost like, I was falling for whatever it is that Tessia's mother seems to think is true about having these abilities. But the more I hang out with regular people, the more I start to be like, maybe this isn't as like seen as such a like special, desirable thing as much as just kind of a weirdo, like, oh, she can do that. Well, I mean, that's helpful and everything, but keep the kids away from her, you know? So I'm just curious how that's going to work out. Martin said, it's also due to class. I think Tessia is looking up, whereas Jerem, am I spelling those right, is looking down. No, Jayan, Jayan is his name. Like if you won $100,000, you or me, it would be a huge deal, but a billionaire, it would mean nothing. That's true, Martin. Yeah. And also, again, she's a woman, and I'm not sure Jayan understands how completely penned in she felt before she got this news, because basically she wanted to continue on being a healer, and her mother was essentially like, no, marry someone, put this aside. It's not even marry someone and you can be a healer, but just have a family too. It's, you cannot continue to work and be married, and you get to pick one, and I want you to be taken care of. So I don't think he quite gets just how few options are available to her. And this might mean something, you know, so we'll see. But I just really like this, you know, the way these thoughts are phrased in his head, that it's very clear how he's like grudgingly giving her credit on some things, not giving her credit on other things that maybe he should, and trying to frame everything like he's just trying to be fair to Dakin, or he wouldn't want her to get her hopes up too much or whatever, you know. And Jayan felt an unexpected sympathy for her then. She probably had no idea where her natural powers were going to lead her. She could become trapped in a social limbo, caught between the advantages of magic and its inescapable limitations. Yeah, which is an interesting, again, you know, if she's wrong about the opportunities that's going to be available to her, she's going to be a little startled at how the whole horizon isn't open the way that she had thought. So he comes downstairs and he meets them. And I really like, again, moments like this, he is thinking, he meets the healer, Varen, and is looking at his wife and is thinking to himself, what is her name? Because he can't remember. And it's moments like that where I feel like if this were a character that was hopeless, he would just be like, and his wife, whatever her name was. It's not that, though. He's not dismissing her. He's going, fuck, what is her name? Like, he wants to do his best, you know? And he's noticing that both the wife and Tessia are wearing these, like, really unflattering, squarely cut dresses. And I'm wondering whether that's the style or if that's simply what common people wear. And if they go to the city, which is announced at the end of this, is she going to be fitted up with a new wardrobe? Because that'd be fun. I always like a makeover. I'm just saying. So Dakin introduces them, and there is quite a spread at this dinner. There are those, you know, that basically a turducken, meats jammed inside other meats, with like fruit in the center. Lots of different cakes and veggies and all. Like, Jayan is kind of distracted by how weird it is that Dakin is out here like carving all of the food and making this sort of ceremony about it. And he's like wondering if this is something that's like a really old tradition. And Jayan realizes that Dakin is enjoying doing this. And I wonder about, because Dakin's out here in the country, it doesn't seem like he really misses the city too much. It's just more that he recognizes that the city has its advantages in certain ways that the country simply can't compete with. But he is like, I think maybe just missing this social aspect of it, you know? So I sort of liked that detail, and it makes me want to get to know Dakin a little bit more. Jayan glanced at Tessia now and then. She was not pretty, he decided, but neither was she ugly. Young women in the lay were likely to be either slim and hard-muscled from work, or buxom and generous like some of the residents' house servants or crafters' wives. Tessia was neither skinny or curvaceous, as far as he could tell. So finally, the lord of the house begins to ask her and her family if they have any questions about magic and the way that this works. And she wants to know where magic is generated, and he says it's a matter of some controversy. Some people say the mind, other people say the heart. He says he feels like it has to be the mind because the heart is so sort of fickle and unpredictable and outside of our control, that if magic came from some place that was based in emotions, there would be no controlling it. Which, you know, feels like a very left brain sort of answer to me. But maybe he's right. Who knows? And she asks, you know, basically, how does the body generate magic? Essentially asking, like, why some people have magic and other people don't. And the answer to this is bananas to me. He says, an even greater mystery. Some believe that it is the result of friction caused by all the rhythms in the body. Blood pulsing through pulse paths, breath through the lungs. And Tessia says, does that mean people with magical ability have a faster pulse and breathing rate? No, Varen answered for Dakin, but since some substances create friction more easily than others, perhaps a magician's blood is different somehow and more able to create friction. He shrugged. It's a strange idea, and one my father didn't think much of. Nor the theory of the stars, Dakin said, smiling. And they both sort of laugh about that. And it turns out that there's a little story here that Varen's dad was not... He was practicing during an era when healers would blame a lot of their failures to help their patients on the fact that the stars and planets were not aligned correctly. And Varen's dad basically was like, you know who says things like that? Incompetent people who are trying to cover their ass. That's who says that. The stars and the planets have nothing to fucking do with it. Knock it off. And understandably, people who had been sort of leaning on that explanation took some offense to the fact that he kind of threw them out on Front Street. And he was eventually like run out of the guild that he was part of. A few of them made life so difficult that when my father offered him a position, he was happy to take it. And her mother asks about the difference between natural magic and regular magic that is like activated by a magician, which is a really like, that's still a concept that I have trouble wrapping my head around, that there are people who have magic that is innate, but not accessible unless somebody else with power taps into it for them, which I find kind of crazy. I like that that's like, I like that there are two different options for how this works, because the fact that there would be no other real believable explanation for why lower class magicians weren't just as much of a thing as upper class magicians. If it turns out to kind of be something that you have to test for the majority of the time and actually activate in somebody, they're of course going to restrict that to noble classes and only teach somebody with natural ability because they cannot be ignored any longer, you know? But it is just such a wild idea. So he says that, you know, if the magic surfaces without somebody tapping into it, it has to be pretty strong magic. But in the end, that strength isn't going to matter much. And he says, higher magic adds to a magician's natural ability. So in the end, it's how many apprentices a magician has taken power from and how many times that dictates his strength, not his natural ability. And that I keep forgetting that taking power is not something that's like taboo right now. You know, like the way that this works in this era is just different. And I'm also like, it's not until this scene again that Tessia, when she's like, can you use magic to heal people? And he basically is like, you can use magic to replace tools that you have. You can use it to, you know, like bind somebody's wound up temporarily. You can use it to create a pressure somewhere when you have to like hold blood back or whatever, but it won't actually help with the healing process. And we know that that's not actually true, but she has not reached a point where she is going to be experimenting with that. And I am very interested to see what drives her to try something like that, because I figure she's going to be the one to discover that magic can indeed be used that way, and he just isn't aware of it. So that'll be fun, but we'll have to see when that happens. So you might not, let's see, who would teach them? There aren't enough magicians to teach all the latent magicians among the rich, let alone commoners as well. You might not want to teach all of them anyway, Varen added, his expression thoughtful. I'm sure you consider character when you select an apprentice, even if he or she is from a powerful family. When you have a choice, of course. Dakin smiled. You are right. Fortunately, Tessia is of excellent character, and I'm sure will be a pleasure to teach. So her mother asks what being a source for a magician involves. And he says, well, I can't tell you everything since that's kind of a secret, but I can tell you it's a quick ritual that she must participate in. Magic is transferred from apprentice to magician and stored by the magician. This giving of power is the only payment Tessia makes in exchange for apprenticeship? Yes, and you can imagine it is more than payment enough. By the time an apprentice is ready to become a magician, he or she will have made their master many hundreds of times stronger than he would be without their help. Of course, we aren't usually hundreds of times stronger by then because we will have used that power in the meantime, but it does allow us to do many things. And Tessia asks, like, well, if you guys take power from your apprentices, why don't you just get a bunch of apprentices so that you can have a lot of power? And he's like, well, it would take a lot of time to teach all of those apprentices. We don't take our teaching lightly. We are not confident that teaching that many people at once would be actually like functionally practical. And he says, and I think having several apprentices would make me feel too much like a Sachakan magician with a crowd of slaves to abuse. So yeah, it's interesting because they're like, in essence, doing the same thing as Sachakan magicians, but they are couching it in some other respectability that makes it much more acceptable to everybody. And I find that really interesting. I'm not totally sure if Trudy Canavan meant for this to be a bit of a commentary, but like it's something to me that the Sachakans are really looked down on for the way they treat people, and yet we had like it's pretty clear that the way things work here is in a lot of in its essence fairly similar. It's just got a kinder face on it. And we're meant to sort of believe, I guess, that everybody in Kyralia is simply kinder to their servants than any Sachakan is to their slaves. But that's so, like, that's just such an unbelievable stance to take. You know, like, not everybody is kind. Not every master is somebody who is going to treat their servants with respect, even if they're not slaves. They're still lower class. Like, we saw firsthand in the Magician trilogy the way that Regin was behaving towards Sania, and she was just a dwell. It wasn't even that she was a servant, but he still saw her that way and still treated her that way. So I just find it really funny that, like, we keep on coming back to this sort of like, oh, well, I don't want to be like the Sachakans. All Sachakans are like this. All Keralians are better and kinder than that. There is no reason that should be true, unless you just want this to be that black and white and oversimple, which I kind of feel like doesn't ring true for this author. But then, the Black Magician trilogy ended with a pretty black and white battle between the good European style magicians and the terrible brown slave magicians. So I constantly am torn with the way that Trudy handles things. Sometimes she is very subtle about stuff and does things that are pleasant and undercutting like an expectation that I have and subverting all kinds of tropes. And then she'll do something like this that's so over the top black and white that I'm like, you can't mean that though. And I don't really know what to make of it. We'll see how this goes, but based on how the previous book went, I'm not super optimistic about it. And I'm just, I brought up these concerns in the previous episode covering this, that it feels even more overt this time around because of the connection. Like in the previous books, the Sachakans don't even come into play until like the final book. Like we don't, see a lot of what happened with them. We don't hear about the history of them in Keralia. There's a lot about the way that it's slowly built up that you don't really see what she's doing until we're in the middle of it. And you're kind of like, well, this bothers me, but I'm not going to get hung up on it because that really wasn't the main part of the story. But because she's having Sachakans be part of the story from the beginning here, having their culture be such a huge factor in the way that people talk about them and approach them. And she is having them like coming and visiting and living with temporarily the magicians in Keralia. I just feel like it's throwing all of this into much sharper relief, how poorly she has handled this. And I'm worried that that's not going to be recovered from. But I'm also like kind of in the back of my mind hoping that because that's so much more of a main factor, she will handle it better because she has to, because it is going to be more of a focal point and we won't be able to just hand wave stuff anymore. But I don't know. So, okay, let me get refocused. Let's see. Oh yeah, we have Hanara and he is having a bad dream. And he is thinking about cutting down trees, and how one of the trees falls and like crushes somebody, but nobody goes to help him because he's only a slave and they know that they will get whipped if they try and help. And he wakes up and he's really like relieved that he's in Keralia, but he is under no illusions that he's actually free. He's sure, positive that his master Takato is going to come back to get him. And that if he's not healed up, first of all, Takato is going to kill him. And also that he's like part of a longer ploy. And let's see. Yeah. The plank was removed from Inaro's hand. His arms hurt. The world whirled around him. Looking down, he saw that his skin was crisscrossed by countless scars and new bleeding cuts. Takato was looming over him, laughing. "Are you a good slave?" he asked. "Are you?" He raised an arm, in his hands a glittering curved blade. Hanara jolted awake again. He willed his heart to stop racing. And this is when they come in and talk to him and ask him how he's doing. He says he's doing better. and he sees Tessia and thinks of her as looking like a newborn slave child, vulnerable and ignorant. But when looking at the slave child, he also felt sympathy and sadness. He knew the hardship and pain it would face and hoped that it would be strong enough and lucky enough to achieve a feeling of long life. And I really like this little paragraph here. Hanara did not yet feel he'd reached long life. It was a state, slaves said, where you felt satisfied you had lived long enough, where you didn't feel cheated if you died. You might not have an easy life or a happy one, but you'd had your measure. Or you had made a difference to the world, even a small one, because you had existed. He'd known slaves who had said they'd reached that state in under 20 years, and old slaves who still didn't feel they'd achieved it yet. Some said it came when they'd sired or birthed a child. Some said it happened when they had completed the best work they'd ever done. Some said it was an unexpected benefit of helping another slave. Some even said it came from serving their master well and loyally. It was said most slaves never felt it. Hanara hadn't felt it even when a child he'd suspected he'd fathered had been born. He'd never had a chance to make his best work with wood. He'd helped other slaves in only minor ways, which didn't give him any great feeling of satisfaction. Serving Takato was probably the only chance he'd have of feeling long life. Ironically, it was also likely to lead to his dying before he had that chance. So I really like that, this concept of, reaching a point where you feel satisfaction with your life. It's obviously something that I think we all look for, and it's very elusive and kind of impossible to even define. And he also thinks about how foolish these people are for thinking that his master isn't going to come back. He just, it's sort of frustrating to him that they all are that ignorant. Takato only said Lord Dakin could do whatever he wanted with me, because if he had revealed he was coming back for me, Lord Dakin might have tried to hide me away. He doesn't know Takato. He loves a hunt. He will track me down and find me. He'll read my mind and find out I ran away from him. Then he'll kill me. I'm better off waiting until he returns. And enjoying what freedom he could have in the meantime. Or does he expect me to go home as soon as I'm able to? Will he only return here if I don't? Only punish me if I stay here? And that is something as we see later on, Hanara is not having he's not having great success in fitting in. And everybody sort of assigns that to the fact that he's not used to freedom, that he doesn't know how to exist without being constantly subservient and calling people master and sticking to the traditions and mores that he is used to from Sashaka. But when we read this, it becomes clear that every moment that he's out doing his job as a servant, he's second guessing whether or not he's supposed to be handling things this way. He is low-key wondering whether or not he is supposed to be trying to head back home. If Takato decides to come and retrieve him and he is actually still here, but also fully healed and functioning again, is that going to be a fucking problem? And that kind of uncertainty will definitely lead to you not wanting to make eye contact, not feeling comfortable enough to befriend anybody. You just don't feel permanent enough, so you're not going to make an effort in that way, So next chapter, chapter 7, is Tessia waking up in her new bedroom. And she is not used to living someplace that has such finery. The room is really big. Her bed is really nice and comfy. She has this humongous fireplace. There's just a lot about it, even though it's pretty simple, honestly, that is a huge step up for her. And there's also having a servant to attend to her. Malia comes in and has the water for her washing, and then asks her what she wants for breakfast, and she's kind of what do you have? And is kind of unsure of herself. And then when she's done eating, she starts to bring the tray out and downstairs, and Malia has to be girl, no, what are you doing? That's my job. Don't do this. And I really enjoy that myself, because it's the kind of thing that it reminds me of just even going to a kind of quick service restaurant that has an operation that you're not really like familiar with. So you don't know, do I clean my own table? Do I leave stuff here? Do I pay up front, or does somebody come and take our ticket? Like, there's all kinds of little things that you just don't know how to handle. So if you are somebody that's lower class, you don't want to come across as seeming too entitled. So you go a little bit too far in trying to do things yourself because you're not really sure what's expected of you. And you'd rather come across as being too helpful than as being like having too much of an expectation of other people doing everything for you. And that is just something that really rang true to me. Emilia has to be like, no, this is my job. Like, let me do my thing. And you know, it's not like Tessia is like hugely embarrassed by it, but she's just off her footing. So this is when Tessia gets sent down to her first lesson with Dakin. And it's very similar, you know, to the first lessons with Sania about accessing her magic and having him in her mind and figuring out exactly how to control things. She breaks that vase. And they get interrupted. There is a servant that comes in, and they said Lord Narvellan of Laurenlay has arrived. And so he cuts their lesson off short and gives her a stack of books to read from and goes and visits with that guy. And she's sort of wondering, like, because it's obvious that Dakin wasn't expecting this dude. And she's sort of interested in whether or not that's a really common occurrence. Do people just show up all the time? So then we go to Dakin, and he is talking to Narvellan. And this is an interesting, so they are part of what they call a circle of friends. And they had agreed, along with like some other lay owners and some lords, to meet a few times a year and discuss issues. And it was like an informal arrangement that was meant to sort of give them a sense of community when the majority of them lived in sort of isolated, distant areas and didn't have a lot of peers to draw from the way that people in a city would. And they hadn't really thought too much of it because it was such an informal thing. But the king found out about it and was kind of uncomfortable with this organization that had cropped up under his nose, that he sort of saw the potential to be a threat if they all decided to team up in some way. And they had to sort of assure the king that that wasn't what was going on. But their purpose had grown and evolved into something else when news and rumors began to reach them suggesting that young Sachaka magicians wanted to reconquer Curalia. Dakin hadn't shared their worries until he had received an order from the king some weeks back to seek from Ashaki Takato his purpose for visiting Curalia if he should pass through Mandrin. And this guy, Narvellan, who's visiting, had also been told to try and find out what his meeting, or what his purpose was for being here. And they talk about the slave, and, you know, he asks Dakin if you've read his mind yet, and Dakin says no. But later on, Dakin decides to do it because he's just like, you know, it would be really stupid of me if something happened that he had known about and I didn't want to, like, violate a stranger by reading their mind and then let people get hurt because of it. And he says, keep a close eye on him. If you're not going to read his mind, at least, like, you know, watch what he's doing. Because changing over from a slave to a free man cannot be an easy thing. And these slaves have loyalty bred deep in them. And, you know, that's something that I think is absolutely true. There are so many stories of people having difficulty adjusting to totally new circumstances after a lifetime of being treated one certain way. And slavery, if you are like born into it especially, that would be a really difficult thing to sort of move past mentally. And Dakin says that he doesn't know for sure that Takato was doing anything shady, But basically, Takato always gives off the impression that he's doing something shady anyway, and he just has a hard time thinking that the dude was completely on the up and up during his visit. And he says he did try some mischief before he left, tried to force himself on a woman. And Narvellan is like, is that why he just decided so suddenly to leave? And Dakin says, no, I just think he wanted to remind us that he could still do shit to us because that was also part of him beating his slave half to death right in front of me, is him flexing, basically, And Narvellan says, I just don't understand why we have to let any of them into our country. So this is what I'm talking about when I start to be like really uncomfortable with, there's not even like a good one that they can point to. There's not even a single Shichakan that they feel like, well, this guy is okay. They just seem across the board to be a whole country full of people that no Kiralians want anything to do with. And I'm just like, So then they hear about or Narvellan tells Dakin about how there's all of these different stories about Shichakans that have been claimed that they have gotten mixed up about where they are in the mountains, but they've been kind of on the Kiralian side of the border, and that it's it's a good enough story that nobody can really do anything about it, but it's very suspicious. They've been building these walkways that seem to be meant for people who don't have magic, and people had been disappearing when they were going up into the mountains. Even when they went up and they had good weather and they were in good health, they just vanished. Just a lot of signs pointing to some shit's going on around the border. They're taking people, they're hurting people, they're preparing to be able to come over. And it's obviously really starting to ramp up, based on what winds up happening with Tessia later. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here because this conversation kind of goes on in this vein for a while. And they're talking about, whether or not they would win or lose. And Narvellan is basically whether we would win or lose isn't even the question, because that comes after whether or not we would manage to actually unite against them. And city magicians are just so afraid of confrontation, and they don't like the remote magicians and stuff. So, and we're right on this main pass, and if they do decide to attack, we're going to be the first ones to go down. So yeah, this whole thing essentially leads to Dakin being told that his reputation is one of somebody being very steady, and he tells about how he has a new apprentice to teach, and this guy assumes that it's a boy, and he's like, no. So then we go to Tessia, and she is having her spoken lessons with Dakin, and Jayan is caught in he's in the background. He's doing his own thing, but he is obviously listening to her lesson, and he keeps kind of snorting or coughing or making derisive sounds when she asks certain questions. And Dakin has been really insistent that Tessia ask these questions, but then she's getting self-conscious because Jayan's being such a dick about it. So later on, Jayan and Dakin talk, and Dakin's just basically you're going to need to just cover for the fact that you obviously resent her for some reason. And he does to a point, but he can't help but say some shit still. They run into each other on the stairs, and Jayan is sort of taunting her because she is going to go help her father and miss some class. And he says something about how oh, well, missing class again, huh? And he tries to make it sound like he's joking, but she can tell he's not. And that is my least favorite passive aggressive thing, when somebody tries to act like what they're saying is they mean it as a joke, when you fucking know they are absolutely 100% serious. And she just snaps on him a little bit and is you know what? At least I have the fucking skill. So go fuck yourself. And it's pretty great in my opinion. And Dakin is just sort of sitting back and letting them figure this out. He is not mediating the way I expected. And I'm kind of glad. They do need to sort of figure out how they're going to handle each other. And let's see. And then we have chapter 9, and Tessia is learning how to heat water, to like light fires in restricted spaces. And she goes and sees Hanara in order to see how he's healing. And she says something about how she'll come back and talk to him now and then. And he seems really like relieved about it. And when she walks away, she's thinking over about the fact that he's actually pretty attractive, yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm interested in this. I don't think so. You know, she knows that her mother would basically disown her if she got involved in an ex-slave from Sachaka. But I also am just not interested because I don't want that for Hanara. I feel like he's in a bad place and he needs to get his own shit sorted out before he gets romantically involved with somebody. So this is when she goes and assists with her father with that surgery, and the family is unsettled by the fact that she used the light. And her father is just kind of like, listen, I get that that's helpful. You should use it, but be a little careful about who you use it in front of. Give them some warning. Don't just spring it on it. And then when she goes back to Dakin's, he tells her that they are going to be going to Imardine, to the city. And they are going to be gone for about a month. And she's obviously really concerned about being gone that long because her father has needed her help several times just since she's been here. And she knows that the other person that he has as his apprentice is coming along well. But still, there have been times where it has been her that's necessary and she won't be around. And I'm interested in how this is going to go because Jayan is obviously going to be much more at ease in the city than she is. And I'm just wondering how exactly they're going to cope in each other's company, both being from such different places, thrust into this like new social situation. So that's the end of that section. All right, everybody. Well, I'm going to wrap this up. I want to say thank you again very much to Ashleigh for commissioning this. I believe that there is another episode coming up fairly shortly of this same book. So that'll be good because, you know, there had been a bit of a gap there because there have been so many properties that are getting demanded. But I'm implementing a new system for the time being that will prevent a new property from being brought into the mix. And we won't be able to start something new until some of these have finished. So hopefully that'll help. All right, everybody. Well, thank you again so much. Hope you're enjoying the coverage, and I will see you again soon with a new episode. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.